As the current Israel-Gaza war crosses its 9-month mark this July 7th, the conflict no longer appears to be one among the many customary skirmishes between Israel and Gaza-based Palestinian militants that the region has grown used to in the past 2 decades. Both in casualties and length, this war has taken a more expansive character, nearing the status of a regional war, as several states and non-state actors take active roles in supporting the belligerents. The Houthis in Yemen, in an attempt to support Hamas, have mounted a blockade of ships headed to and from Israel and Israel's allies through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Hezbollah has struck northern Israel with daily rocket barrages, forcing evacuations of residents in Israel's north. The group has also threatened an October 7th-style attack on northern Israel. To Israel's east, Iran-backed militias in Iraq have occasionally fired drones at Israel to back Hamas. In April, Iran and Israel have even directly clashed, exchanging airstrikes. You're listening to Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose. I'm Andrew Jose, a Washington, D.C.-based security policy analyst and news reporter, bringing you timely analyses and commentary on issues in international relations, war, and security policy. What is the future of Israel's relations with its adversaries in the region? What about Yemen, Lebanon? To answer these questions, I will be speaking today with New York-based geopolitical analyst, journalist, and national security lawyer Irina Tsukerman. Irina Tsukerman is a foreign policy analyst and national security lawyer based in New York. She is a fellow at the Arabian Peninsula Institute and the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Irina is also the president of Scarab Rising, a media and security strategic advisory firm. She is the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, a project of Scarab Rising focused on foreign policy, geopolitics, security, and human rights. Her analyses have appeared in major publications, including Newsweek, National Interest, Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, and Arab News. Irina Tsukerman, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here.
Israel's border with Lebanon has been heating up since October 7th. Hezbollah has been firing regular rocket barrages, prompting internal displacement up north. Talk among Israeli officials and analysts and plans by many countries to evacuate their citizens from Lebanon all hint at a possible war with Hezbollah. What is the likelihood of us seeing a Israel-Hezbollah war in the near future? Should there be a war, what will it look like?
Everything is pointing out that the war could break out as early as 3 weeks from now. There's been every sign of preparation for the war effort. You've had senior generals visiting the Northern Front. You have statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu warning about the preparations for the war. And of course, there's been evidence of escalation between the two sides that show the likely inevitability of some sort of engaged combat action due to the increasingly aggressive nature of attacks by Hezbollah. They include arson attacks on the north. And of course, parts of the north have been evacuated since October with 1,000 Israelis, as many as 100,000 Israelis not being able to return home. Now, of course, this could be a very different type of war from what is happening in Gaza. For one thing, there are rumors that Hezbollah has actually started evacuation of civilians from its own side, which means that essentially the Israelis would be facing mostly combatants, very clearly marked combatants in the front lines, even if they're not necessarily wearing uniform. So the sort of concerns and restrictions and humanitarian and human rights pushback against the urban warfare in Gaza, that would likely not come up until and unless you have a situation of complete entry into Lebanon, which is also a question. There have been some parties essentially trying to push Israel to enter Lebanon, not only to engage in a full front invasion. I don't know that it will come to that, but it is true that Hezbollah is a very different organization from Hamas. It is much more of a paramilitary or quasi-army than it is a terrorist organization with limited asymmetrical resources. It's got at least 150,000 long-range missiles in its possession. It is better trained, even though Hamas has grown substantially in the past few years. Hezbollah is considered to be the most important asset for Iran from a military perspective. So we are facing, on the one hand, much less concern about potential high-level civilian casualty, but on the other hand, a huge arsenal of rockets and a huge, well-prepared and very serious force with sophisticated surveillance capabilities, as we have seen from a recent drone video of Haifa released by Hezbollah. Very different type of war, and let's not forget that Israel would have to allocate some of its reserves, fighting reserves, to the fight in the north, given that the operations in Gaza are not yet over, and it's not clear when they're going to be over. Some are saying that the Gaza fighting could take as much as 6 to 8 months to complete. What that would look like if you're fighting a two-front war, it could be very, very different. And there's also been concerns about the access to equipment for both North and South France, so that too could complicate this war.
One of the things Hezbollah has periodically flaunted is its personnel, some with battle experience in Syria, and also the group's artillery systems and drones. How has the group been allowed to accrue so much strength over the years that it is considerably powerful? Would you say it's a policy failure by Israel, the US, and Lebanon? How has this come to be?
Well, it's not for lack of trying on Israel's part. We have seen that Israel has fought another war with Hezbollah in 2006, but it did not. At that point, the IDF was not, could arguably was underprepared, it could be said, and they lacked in the equipment necessary to achieve a very decisive victory. Hezbollah at the time was also not what it is today, but it was already a fairly strong force that has been active for decades. Let's not forget the deadly Hezbollah-lead attacks in Lebanon on U.S. forces, in Hezbollah's involvement in Argentina's bombings. It has been an international fighting force, not just a local militia, for decades already. In terms of, so Israel has tried to disrupt its activities as much as possible, but Israel was also distracted with Gaza and West Bank related matters. It was not well prepared for full-front confrontation with Hezbollah, and it was also not prepared for direct confrontation with Iran, which has been supplying Hezbollah with these types of weapons. U.S. would have been in a far better position to disrupt these operations, but for many years, the U.S. has tried to actually circumvent this issue through direct negotiations with Iran, second through policies of engagement with Lebanon, and essentially pretending away that Hezbollah is actually a functional part of governance in Lebanon, and not merely and acting as if it's merely a separate entity that happens to be operating in Lebanon, which was not the case in a long time. Hezbollah has achieved political support in Lebanon, and first through the so-called social jihad, and eventually through outright terrorizing of the population, accumulation of bases of support among the Shia portions of the population, and through political deals with some of the more corrupt Christian parties. So Hezbollah has become a political problem as much as a military problem, and trying to intervene in the supply of weapons could also bring accusations of attacking a sovereign state. So U.S. did not want to get engaged directly in the disruption of the supply chains. They wanted to deal with Iran only diplomatically, and also U.S. recognized the Lebanese military forces as an ally and provided them for many years, for decades, I would say, with official support and funding, which is still the case to this date. And other countries like France at various times tried to negotiate with Hezbollah, with the Lebanese government. There's been a period of time when Syria was quite influential in Lebanon as well, which further complicated matters when Lebanon at one point was basically a colony of Syria's Assad. And we have seen from a colony of Syria, Lebanon basically become a colony of Iran, and less so than a completely independent state. So yes, there's been a lot of policy failures, but those policy failures are not merely a lack of sufficient military decision-making, it's also a political misassessment which bore fruit and continues to bear fruit to this day. This rejection of seeing Lebanon as merely, at this point, an extension of Iran's foreign policy in the region.
Lebanon is a sectarian country. About Lebanese Maronite Christians, what role do you think that they would play in this conflict? Do you think Israel would work with Lebanese Maronite Christians as it did in the 1982 Lebanon War? Or do you think that Israel is going to try to pursue Hezbollah independently like it attempted to do in the 2006 Lebanon War?
Well, I think it's harder to call Maronite Christians a uniform monolithic party at this point. As I mentioned, some of the parties made a very calculated move to side with Hezbollah at this point, which inherently makes them on the side of Hezbollah and Iran, despite the fact that you would think that Hezbollah's quest for monopoly on power is antithetical to their interests. But many Christians fled Lebanon, unwilling to deal with their situation. Those who remain closely tied to government circles are enabling the sort of corruption that helps Hezbollah move in and take advantage of the economic situation to begin with. They're not necessarily the sort of parties Israel could align with, even if they wanted to. They're simply not necessarily going to side with Israel against Hezbollah. Those of the population of the Christians who are opposed to Hezbollah, who are still in Lebanon, might be able to assist on some small level, but they no longer have the independent power to make much of a difference necessarily. I also think that Israel in general has become far more cautious in terms of relying on any particular group, ethnicity, or religious party in formulating its own military policy in such confrontations, precisely due to that previous experience. The trust is not there. There is an example of betrayal, and the political alignment misfired on Israel, with Israel being eventually accused of the human rights abuses that were perpetrated by some of the militias back in the day. So this is not something that Israel wants to contend with, given especially the bad publicity from Gaza. I do think that, as with any war, Israel, of course, will look for whoever is willing to support the anti-Hezbollah movement. I think it will find a lot of people from different backgrounds are deeply unhappy with Hezbollah and who wish to see it gone. But many of these people are disempowered. They may not be in position to assist with anything other than non-intervention on behalf of Hezbollah or logistics and intelligence and things like that. And I don't think it's just going to be Christian Maronites. I think they're Sunni Muslims and even Shia Muslims who want to see Iran's hand out of their country at this point, and they would be willing to cooperate quietly. Whether or not this is going to be a formal alliance of the sort we've seen decades ago, I very much doubt.
Lebanon's formal government, how do you think the Lebanese army and Lebanon's government react to an Israeli attack or invasion of southern Lebanon? Do you think the Lebanese army would also engage Israeli forces?
I don't think Israel wants to invade Lebanon. I think they will do everything possible to avoid a situation where they have to do more than simply push Hezbollah forces out of the way sufficiently to not continue, in that direction. But we already seen that the Lebanese prime minister spoke out against Israel, blaming them for what's happening in Gaza, of course, and warning them away from an engagement in Lebanon, even though he knows fully well who is to blame for the situation. Hezbollah's relentless attacks since day one, which have only escalated over time, are entirely an initiative of Hezbollah with no provocation whatsoever from Israel. I do think that even those in the Lebanese government who are wary of Hezbollah presence are at this point not fully independent, and they cannot really contend with Hezbollah or go against it. And I think there's sufficient influence and penetration of the Lebanese armed forces by Hezbollah that it can also not be called entirely an independent entity, which is why continuing to fund and arm it by the United States at this point in time is already a mistake. It is not an allied force. It's a force that is, in best case scenario, penetrated by Hezbollah, and worst case scenario, large portions of it could side with Hezbollah in the event of a full-front confrontation or Israel's invasion. Of course, Israel will do whatever it needs to guarantee the safety of its own citizens, including taking the fight all the way to the end. I don't think they want to do that. I don't think they necessarily view the entire country as a target or as an enemy, but they do understand that Hezbollah's presence makes it impossible for everyone else not to be involved in some capacity.
During the Gaza war, we have seen Hamas being supported by Houthis and Iraq-based militias. In the event of a war with Hezbollah, how do you think the so-called axis of resistance will come to play? What will the escalation ladder look like with the axis of resistance involved?
Already the axis of resistance is much better integrated than even just a couple years ago. And they have been working very closely together, both on military, financial, communications, and political matters, where previously many of them would have found differences and political clashes due to the very diverse nature of some of these groups. And we are going to see even more so over time, even if without the war with Hezbollah. But I think the war would expedite and advance this cooperation very, very quickly and very, very far. We are already seeing the RGC, for instance, sending their contingents to train in Lebanon in preparation for the war, so we can expect Iranian forces to potentially directly get involved with Hezbollah, especially if there is a good chance that Hezbollah forces are going to be decimated physically. Now, of course, the Iran and others are relying on overwhelming Israel's defenses with Hezbollah's arsenal of missiles, but that is not the only aspect to the war. I think there is a much greater deal of parity in the physical forces than Hezbollah cares to admit. After all, they're not a full-on army, and they have not had direct confrontation with Israel since 2006 in such a direct face-to-face way. So it's not clear whether they're just how well their estimation of IDF power is. Israelis, on the other hand, have been training specifically against Hezbollah capabilities, and I think their assessment of Hezbollah's strength is likely to be far better than the other way around. But let's not forget the other parties. Now, the Houthis so far have already been fairly engaged even without Hezbollah's full involvement. They've had a very clear mission, which is to disrupt the shipping, to make it very difficult for Israel's allies and to continue staying allies, and make it very expensive for them to continue to engage with Israel economically. They've also been testing their own efforts in disrupting Israel directly, through their own missiles. I think if Hezbollah gets involved, Hezbollah has been training the Houthis, and the Houthis have actually, their military training has been based on Hezbollah and on IRGC. So we will see a far greater level of direct cooperation to the point of possible commingling of the forces to some extent. But I don't think the Houthi mission will substantially change due to the geographic necessity. I think we're likely to see more Hezbollah in Yemen, but not necessarily more Houthis traveling to, say, Lebanon, simply because they have a clear need to continue disrupting things, the shipping in the Red Sea, to continue causing problems from that angle. I don't think they need it all that much in Lebanon until and unless Hezbollah clearly starts losing the war. Then we could see a great deal more of Houthis probably coming in to join them, and we could see other forces as well, which have previously volunteered to help in Gaza, even Taliban. And we have seen the involvement of pirates in Somalia join the fray, and there's some coordination with them. There's some coordination with Al-Shabaab. Inside Yemen, the Houthis are coordinating with elements of Al-Qaeda. Are all these forces going to necessarily work together? It's not clear, but it is clear that some of them will certainly use an opportunity of any big confrontation to jump in for their own reasons and to cause problems for Israel, even if they're not directly linked to Iran. So it is going to be a far more complicated confrontation. We certainly going to see Iraqi and Syrian militias also attempt to put pressure on Israel from those fronts as well, just to distract from the main war with Hezbollah. Iran is very concerned about losing Hezbollah as an asset because it is their most successful project in the region, so they will try to cause very much to weaponize the encirclement of Israel by these various fronts and forces as much as possible. And as I mentioned, the coordination overall will improve and increase significantly.
Aside from the axis of resistance, another regional actor that has expressed support for Hezbollah has been Turkey under President Erdogan. How do you think President Erdogan will follow up on his statement of support for Hezbollah when he said that all Islamic countries should support Lebanon? Do you think he's just going to give moral and diplomatic support, or is there a possibility that Turkey could escalate its hostility towards Israel by potentially arming Hezbollah?
Well, let's not forget two things. On the one hand, Turkey is facing a significant financial problem internally, economic problem, now that the U.S. sanctions have kicked in against Russian entities and anyone who does business with them. Turkey is losing a significant aspect of its economic lifeline. So it will look for other solutions such as militarization, which always refocuses the economy on military production. And with that sense, I think Turkey will be looking to provide assistance to its allies and fellow travelers wherever it can, not only for ideological reasons, but as an economic opportunity. Turkey is also already present in Lebanon, mostly in the area of Tripoli, where the local Muslim Brotherhood contingent is based. So far, its involvement has been mostly ideological and humanitarian and quite limited. But Turkey has a fairly good handle in Lebanon and the general area because it views Greece and Cyprus as a very, very prominent targets in that regard. So can Turkish-based operatives provide support to Hezbollah locally with assorted things, intelligence, logistics, even coordination of some sort if necessary? Absolutely. Another issue to remember is that IRGC and Hezbollah are already both present on Turkish soil, and they've been cooperating with the Turkish intelligence on various fronts, including abduction and intimidation of Iranian dissidents and basically defectors who are based in Turkey. They've been cooperating on it. Anti-Kurdish issues, and IRGC at one point attempted an operation abducting Israelis, and did not intervene until it became fairly obvious that the Iranians came close to succeeding. So essentially, Turkey has allowed them to operate with relative freedom. We can certainly assume more of the same going forward. Can it get worse? Can they also be working with elements of the Turkish military or assorted informal groups that have the blessing of Erdogan, Muslim Brotherhood contingents, Hamas operatives based in Turkey? Absolutely, without a question. We can expect a lot of that. Will Turkey necessarily want to show its hand in this war if it sees that Hezbollah has a good chance of losing? Probably not. I think it will continue to very much be a source of open political support, but I think most of its assistance is going to be indirect. I don't think Erdogan wants to get engaged openly in a war he does not think he can win easily.
How do you think other regional actors will respond to this potential war? And I'm talking about Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. Do you think they're just going to watch and maybe give occasional condemnations of Israel's actions? Or do you think they're going to pick a side? And I'm particularly concerned about the reactions of Abraham Accords states like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates.
None of those countries are fans of Hezbollah, to put it mildly. In fact, Nasrallah attacked Egypt quite openly prior to October 7th and got a very harsh response from the Egyptian government. Iran has been trying to normalize with Egypt, but so far with no success. Egypt is one of the last holdouts. Jordan is another country that sees Hezbollah as a direct threat to itself. Jordan has been instrumental in stopping Iranian shipments of weapons to Hamas based in the West Bank. And they've also been targets of drugs such as Captagon, which are partially produced in Lebanon and Syria. So all these countries do view Hezbollah as a direct threat to their own interests and the general stability in the region. But there's a significant difference. First of all, they view the axis of resistance as winning now because Israel has been stuck in Gaza for 9 months. Admittedly, there are good reasons for that, but it also has failed to annihilate people like Sinwar, who are considered to be the physical organizers of the Al-Aqsa flood operation on October 7th. It has failed so far to free all of its hostages. It has faced a great deal of international political backlash. There's been stories about equipment and ammunition shortages. It's been clashing with the U.S. government on some issues. So all of that weakens Israel's military image in the eyes of these countries, makes them less likely to want to get involved on Israel's behalf. What doesn't help is that when Israel did have a more direct opportunity to work against Hezbollah with its Arab neighbors, it has not necessarily done so, despite sending out a very clear political message of support. It has not taken the opportunity to physically engage and integrate when the sentiment in the region was much more favorable to Israel's role in this matter. I think they're more likely to then take a more neutral and passive position to see how Israel actually does physically. I don't think they're necessarily going to be praising Hezbollah. There is still a great deal of concern, but we are also seeing many of these countries normalize with Iran one after another, and so they're less likely to condemn any of Iran's axis of resistance members. Even the Houthis, who have been directly attacking other countries and not just Israel, are now in the middle of peace talks with Saudi Arabia. Unsuccessful and difficult, admittedly, but Saudi Arabia has been reluctant to grant even the U.S. the territorial leverage to attack them from their territory, from their waters. So with Hezbollah, it's very likely to be the same story. And so far as, Israel is not openly prevailing and all these countries remain normalized with Iran, and there is no direct action from the U.S. against any of these entities, whether it's Houthis, Hezbollah, or Iran itself, the Arab states are not going to be, full-fledged allies to Israel, and in some cases they're going to be even siding with Hezbollah. By the way, we have seen UAE for the first time have open diplomatic meetings with Hezbollah leadership and moving in the direction of normalizing with Hezbollah part of it for its own safety, because U.S. is getting increasingly uninvolved or is playing a very limited and defensive role in regional security, and part of it due to Iran's pushback, the failure of the Abraham Accords in many respects. Bahrain, even, which was the last GCC holdout on normalizing with Iran, was finally pushed into expressing interest in normalizing with Iran. They have not yet done so, but they are starting the talks in that direction. And Bahrain is very much representing what Saudi Arabia thinks on this matter. So if the trend is towards normalizing with Iran, it's certainly not in favor of these countries confronting Hezbollah, and certainly not until they see that Israel has a very good chance of succeeding, and that U.S. is actually very seriously reorienting its regional security strategy.
Mm-hmm. In response to Western powers sending arms to Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin of Russia recently threatened to provide arms to groups hostile to the West to attack Western interests. Do you think that a war between Israel and Hezbollah is one conflict where he could act on his threats? Or do you think he's going to stay away from being involved directly in a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah?
Russia will do everything specifically, it will do anything that can harm the West and that can boost its own image and its own role. It's no secret that Putin has been coordinating with Hezbollah in the past on many issues, joint training exercises, sale of weapons, things of that nature. I think he is certainly, he has even opened the back Hamas quite clearly. I think he's certainly not going to shy away from backing his older ally, and his relationship with Hezbollah have been fairly open. And now that Russia's relationship with Iran has taken a new and much more integrated dimension, that we're working on a major treaty together, I think Russia is going to be a far more visible force in any such circumstance. Though I think that they will join the fray quite openly the same way they promised to have a united front with China and North Korea in the event of any confrontation over Taiwan. Probably not. Those relationships are not yet on the same level. But will he be helping them with assorted intelligence matters, with logistics, with political support, even in some level of military advice? Absolutely. Now, let's remember that Russia is facing its own military troubles in Ukraine. It is not fighting a very successful war now that Ukraine has unmitigated capabilities to fire long-range missiles attacks into from the United States that it has acquired from the U.S. into Russia's territory. Russia also has to play defense much more so than in the previous 2 years, and it's facing dramatic shortages of fighting fighting forces. It has lost approximately 600,000 who've been killed or seriously wounded in Ukraine. It has had to reallocate some of its forces from its own borders with the Baltics, from the peacekeepers in the South Caucasus, even the S-300 system from Syria. It has had to move all these things into Ukraine. So on the one hand, a major war with Hezbollah could be the major distraction from Ukraine that Russia craves and seeks, requiring much more weapons for all parties involved. On the other hand, it can't drain its own resources and helping others in their war. So most likely what Russia is going to do is activate its civilian assets as much as possible. Basically, various groups that have been helping Hezbollah in Europe and have been working on acquiring supplies, but from a civilian rather than military side. And I think that is going to be the sort of assistance Russia will be best placed to provide.
What will the end of a conflict with Hezbollah look like? Do you think Israel will win, or do you think Israel will lose, or do you think the outcome would be inconclusive? Who do you think would emerge better off after a war in the north between Hezbollah and Israel?
A lot will depend on what happens, first of all, with Gaza, and whether Israel can secure a clear victory there, whether it can create the sort of... I think the only way for a clear victory in Gaza if Israel creates a pathway to securitizing both Gaza and West Bank alongside other countries in the region. I cannot imagine that Israel can, in the long term, fight its battle, or that endless battle on itself, given the ideological nature of the conflict. It can secure the tunnels to Egypt to prevent Hamas from getting access to weapons, decimate their forces, but it needs a strategy to prevent Hamas from regrouping, and it needs a strategy to keep those tunnels secure in the long term, and it needs a strategy to counter recruitment and reinforcement efforts in the long run, even if it, 8 to 8 months from now, Sinwar still hostages are released, Hamas forces lose a lot of power and ammunition, and that cannot function as a singular force. There needs to be some sort of a way to ensure that they do not rebuild very quickly or at all, and there is an ideological kind of paradigm in place that prevents this quote-unquote resistance from rising up, and that can only happen if Israel succeeds diplomatically and politically in the region. And for now, I just don't see a strategy towards that end. It is possible, but it would require a single-minded commitment to oppose Muslim Brotherhood, to oppose Iran directly, and not, end all of its actions of resistance, and to not view this simply as an Israeli problem, but as a regional problem, and to overcome the current divisions with the Arab states. So that is one aspect of it. Second, a lot depends on Israel's level of preparedness, ability to acquire equipment independent of whoever is in office in the U.S., and to rebuild its own capabilities that have been shaken by the war in the south and by the general level of unpreparedness that has been leaking out through various sources, lack of access to equipment, lack of securing necessary provisions, and so forth. That means a completely re-envisioning of Israel's strategy in the north that does not depend on simply on defensive capabilities to hold an indefinite conflict until Hezbollah runs out of missiles. So because it's not going to run out of missiles, so far as Iran is capable of delivering new missiles, so far as Russia is actively assisting Iran, I think Iran will be able to get new missiles to Hezbollah even if it starts running out of its current supply. So there needs to be a clear strategy that also involves disruptive capabilities, that is more offensive, and not only against Hezbollah fighters on the ground, but also against their reach, their capabilities, their international appeal. All of these groups so Israel needs to be fighting on many fronts. It cannot be looking at it as a very conventional confrontation of the type it would have 10 years ago. If Israel understands the nature of the problem it faces, it can very well win. It can prevail because none of these forces actually contributing anything positive to anybody in the world, including Lebanon. If Israel continues to view it as a simple direct threat to its interests and nothing more than that, and continues to fail to communicate why these groups are actually antithetical to any security interests, to any human rights interests to other countries as well, it will fail, because I think at the end of the day, Iran and Muslim Brotherhood were successful in creating this alternative narrative of resistance, that this is all about the occupation, this is all about liberating anybody. Hezbollah is not liberating anybody, they're enslaving the region just like Iran. It's a colonialist power. So unless Israel finds a way to reverse the tables on the narrative, winning the war is going to be much more difficult.
Coming to the last second question of our episode, recently, Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, made a threat against Cyprus that he could attack Cyprus if it gets involved in some capacity in a war between Hezbollah and Israel. Do you think that should a war occur, that Hassan Nasrallah would start attacking Cyprus, or do you think Hezbollah would be more restrained on that in order to avoid getting into a conflict with the European Union?
Here's the thing about Nasrallah. Nasrallah is, on the one hand, a spiritual pillar of Hezbollah, but on the other hand, he's a guy who's been hiding in the bunker for many years. So it's not clear just how seriously his part was, or his calls are going to be taken by Hezbollah's military leadership. I don't think they want to be fighting on fronts that will split their mission and that will split their forces and force them into a confrontation that they cannot win. Greece and Cyprus, exceptionally violent at this point, can activate local cells and cause terrorist attacks, but full-front military confrontation with both Israel and Cyprus/Greece, and I just don't think it's doable. If by confrontation, if by attacks, he means terrorist attacks, yes, anything is possible. Hezbollah and other terrorists can activate anywhere in the world. But a full confrontation, I don't think Hezbollah currently wants that, no matter what Hassan Nasrallah says. I think this is just a way of signaling to Israel that Hezbollah has an international presence everywhere in the region and could make things more complicated. Yes, it can make matters more complicated. If it activates its cells in Cyprus and in Greece and other countries, it will certainly create a much more difficult situation. But on the other hand, it can galvanize those countries to join Israel much more formally against a common threat, and that's not something that Hezbollah would want. So I would take these comments with a huge grain of salt. I think Hezbollah is escalating its rhetoric to kind of showcase its own significance and reach. But what it means, but pragmatically, I think it will try to stay very, very focused on Israel and not try to give opportunity for other countries to get involved. I think Hezbollah wants the opposite of Israel growing its international support in the region. I think it wants to kind of actually scare others from not getting involved and providing assistance. But I really think that it's going to be managing expectations very carefully, as it has up until this point. It has been slowly escalating over time, but it did not immediately join the war. At the moment Israel invaded Gaza, I don't think it's going to do so now either, unless it becomes necessary for its own goals or survival. And I think it will be balancing rhetoric versus, escalation in other places very carefully against needs and resources.
Moving from the specifics and looking at long-term trends, what do you think that the security environment for Israel going forward is going to look like? How will the conflicts that are currently going on and that will go on in the future affect the Abraham Accords process? And most importantly, what should we expect of Iran?
I think it's a mistake for Israel to steer away from a clear discussion on Iran. First of all, Iran is much closer to nuclear capabilities than it's ever been. Some are arguing that it might have nuclear capabilities or it might have nuclear guarantees from Russia or China, which is why it's as emboldened as it is now. Iran is very much on a genocidal path towards Israel. It's made no secret of it. In 2015, Ayatollah Khamenei actually declared its 2040 plan, which involves the destruction of Israel by that date. And it has been working diligently in that direction. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood is only one aspect of it. The mobilization of information warfare, which quite succeeded in isolating Israel politically. The disruption of the Abraham Accords, and now even attacks on the Camp David Accords with Egypt through propaganda campaigns, mobilizing extremists, and by the way, antagonizing Israel against Egypt as well. That's also been quite successful. So I think the Abraham Accords are in very shaky grounds. Some of the countries have threatened to break the accords, but they've been reluctant to do so in a foreign capacity. It's not a good look that you enter agreements and you talk about doing all these defense operations with Israel, and then all of a sudden you disengage politically over a matter that is not directly does not directly involve them. That's why they have been thinking twice about actually breaking the agreements. But practically speaking, the trade volume is next to nothing. The tourism has deteriorated. There's a rollback of discussions or any sort of support in favor of Israel in some of these countries. Israel is becoming increasingly unwelcome. So I think that politically speaking, it's been a huge loss. And it will take a great deal of rebuilding all these relations to reverse this impact. And I think some of it has started happening before October 7th due to changes in the region that Israel has been turning a blind eye to. It has been focused on domestic matters. It has not been looking towards these countries. It's been relying on a lot of disinformation and kind of open source media information about what goes on in those countries. It has not been looking at the way Iran has been trying to mobilize its own forces, the normalization with Iran, and the impact of the normalization. And the Al-Ula agreement, which brought Qatar back into the fold with the GCC and Egypt, and empowered it to influence local political discourse and interest a great deal, and how it changed the financial trajectory of trade in the region. They haven't been looking at the Muslim Brotherhood trends and the attempted return of the old guards that's been anti-normalization with Israel all over the region. So all of these things have been, all of this political intelligence has been ignored by Israel, which will make it much, much harder to kind of reconstitute and rebuild its political strengths. I mean, step one would be winning the war conclusively, but you have split comments coming in from the Israeli political leadership and military leadership. You have military mistakes being made, such as not going into Rafah and cutting off access to weapons for Hamas right away. There's been a lot of time wasted, arguably speaking. Israel still is stuck in Gaza. The Hamas propaganda machine is working overtime, and Israelis have not been successful in disrupting these Islamist narratives and the optics of the dead babies and so forth in Gaza. So all of these things are certainly are very much making a conclusive victory on any one front very difficult. At the end of the day, Israel has no choice but to emerge as a very clear winner in a very dramatic way. This axis of resistance concept needs to be decimated. It must be made clear that none of these forces put together have any operational future in the region, but Israel has to also understand that it cannot keep evading the source of the problem, which is Iran. With or without the United States, it needs to find ways of making it very costly for Iran to take any further steps in the implementation of its plan. And it needs to sow seeds for Iran to have to deal with internal issues and not be able to focus its efforts externally. That's what I'm going to say about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to geopolitical analyst and journalist Irina Tsukerman. Irina Tsukerman, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for listening to Strategic Wisdom. Be sure to follow and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you're using to listen to this show in order to not miss any future interviews and conversations that I bring to you on this podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe to Strategic Wisdom on Substack at strategicwisdom.substack.com. This is your host, Andrew Jose, signing off.